Good afternoon, everyone. It's happy hour, Friday, 5 p.m., June 19th, 2020. Welcome to the happy hour Whiskey Fellowship edition of WhiskyCast. We're outside today. The weather cooperated. It's a little windy, so you might hear some wind noise in the background. You might hear a few birds. You might hear a plane flying overhead. And that's just the way it is when you work outside. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Gillespie on the porch at WhiskyCast Central in Haddonfield, New Jersey. I hope this week has been a good one for you. We will be talking in just a few minutes with Davin de Kergommeaux from CanadianWhiskey.org. Brad Japhe, a freelance writer who writes for Forbes, Bloomberg, Travel and Leisure, and a whole bunch of other publications, is also scheduled to join us in this hour or so. And we'll take your questions in the chat rooms. You can type in on Facebook, on Periscope, and on YouTube. If you're joining us on Twitter, please don't try to put comments in below us in the tweet and respond to the tweet, because we won't see those until after the show. It's been an interesting week, and one of the things that really sort of started off the week early on was the acquisition by Sazerac of not only early times bourbon, but the Collingwood and Canadian Mist bourbons, or Canadian whiskeys rather, and the Canadian Mist Distillery in Ontario from Brown-Forman, which had owned them for many, many years. And my pal Davin de Kergommeaux from CanadianWhiskey.org joins us right now. Davin, how are you today?
I'm great, Mark. How are you? I'm sweating like crazy. It's really hot up here in Ottawa.
Yeah, that's what I heard. You guys are getting record temperatures all over Canada this weekend.
Yeah, I think we're having summer all week this year. Yeah, so yeah, it's really warm up here.
So what's in your glass, Davin?
Pardon me?
What's in your glass?
Well, I'm drinking. As I said, when I drink beer, I like to drink something I don't have to think about. So this is made by Molson's. It's Molson's Old Style Pilsner. I really enjoy it. It's very uncomplicated and just refreshing. And when it's hot like this, I don't want to think about what I'm drinking.
I don't blame you. And I thought about pulling a beer out since I'm sitting out on the porch today, but decided to hold off. Instead, I posted my tasting notes for this one yesterday. The Jimmy Red bourbon from Wire Distilling in Charleston, South Carolina, made with 100% Jimmy Red corn, which they grow only in South Carolina. The moonshiners loved it because it had a lot of sugar content in it, which of course makes for great alcohol. But also, if you look at this, the color on this is just amazingly red. It's like the color of polished copper. And it's
golly, I wonder where that red comes from, because it doesn't come from the corn.
Oh, this is red corn.
But it doesn't survive distillation. That's anthocyanin. It doesn't survive distillation unless there's something else they've got in there. Wonder if they put some corn in afterwards.
Too, but it is still extraordinarily red.
Yeah.
Come on, Davin. Good to talk with you again, my friend. It's been
good to talk with you too. I see you're in the white picket fence neighborhood of America.
Yep, we're in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And if you're familiar with the Dr. Seuss books, the charming yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield is also known as Whoville, because every time you go around, it's all the little Who's working on their houses, just like in some of the Dr. Seuss books with Whoville. So
that's funny.
Did that a little bit this week myself, working out in the yard, and it's been a gorgeous week around here with nice cool temperatures. I want to get you, before we get to the comments, let's talk about this deal with Sazerac and Brown-Forman. This is Sazerac's real expansion. They'd had some Canadian whiskey interests before, but this is getting serious.
Well, I think it's very serious. And honestly, quite welcome as well. I mean, Sazerac has built that new distillery or refurbished that new distillery in Montreal, and they would have opened this year had it not been for the pandemic. Sazerac has a lot of Canadian whiskey brands in the States. Brands that you may not realize are Sazerac, and so they're already selling a lot of Canadian whiskey, and they're buying a lot of Canadian whiskey from other distilleries to make their brands and fill their bottles. So I think it just makes sense that they own a distillery now. I mean, that's a big distillery. I mean, Canadian Mist is not selling as well as it used to, but it's still over 1 million cases a year, which, and the other than Crown Royal, which of course is just, like 40% of the market, the number two selling Canadian whiskey, Black Velvet, sells only 2 million cases a year. So these guys are in pretty good shape. And, if you take a company like Sazerac that really, takes an interest in its individual brands, I mean, this could be really good for Canadian Mist. And I think also we're going to see a lot of, new Canadian whiskeys coming from Sazerac. So all around, I think it's a good deal for Canada.
And tell us about the Canadian Mist Distillery. It's in Collingwood, right?
Yeah, it's up in Collingwood, Ontario. They used to. I mean, Collingwood is on Lake Huron. Okay, and it used to be a port, a grain port for the lake freighters bringing grain in from the west. So they would bring it in by train to Thunder Bay and then load it into these big freighters and freight it down and stop along the way. Some would go to Hiram Walker, for example, further down in below Lake St. Clair. Some would go on to Montreal. From Montreal, it was in elevators and then shipped across the ocean. But they also stopped in Collingwood, and this is how they used to get all of their grain by ships. And Collingwood was a major shipbuilding inland port. But of course, when they really started shipping all the grain by rail, then Collingwood, the Canadian Mist people went out and they started contracting with local farmers to buy their grain and to grow their grain. So Canadian Mist whiskey now is made with grain that is grown, right, within truck driving distance of the distillery. The farmers deliver it by truck and dump it themselves. It's really quite an interesting operation. They make really they produce only a couple of brands of whiskey that you know about. They do. They make Canadian Mist, which of course is a mixing whiskey, fairly light whiskey. It's a blend of corn whiskey and rye, and they also make a couple of upscale whiskeys like Collingwood, Collingwood and Collingwood, double barrel. And they made one year the best whiskey that was made in Canada was the Collingwood 21-year-old. Just it's a wonderful, fabulous whiskey, and they've got masses of great barrels, old barrels of whiskey in their warehouses. I can see why Sazerac would want those. They also do supply other brands with fillings. I don't know whether that's where Sazerac has been getting their fillings in the past, but certainly will be, I'm sure, where they'll be getting them in the future. So it's a really great distillery. It's a mid-sized distillery, and its market has always been America, really.
And Whiskey Canuck in Montreal has a question. Is this the old Seagram's distillery? I don't think so, but could I be wrong about that?
You're not wrong. That is not the old Seagram's distillery. It was a custom-built distillery built by, I think it was Barton Brands in 1967. It opened, and it's brand new, and it has, been cranking out whiskey since it opened, primarily feeding the pipeline in the United States of America. You haven't seen a whole lot of whiskey from that distillery. Or identified as being from that distillery here in Canada. I know, this is something that's really interesting. You remember like 25 and maybe a few more years ago than that, when John Hall was getting going with 40 Creek, and he had a winery license, but he wasn't distilling yet. He had the stills, but he wasn't using them. He bottled Canadian Mist for Canada, but he bottled it as a 4-year-old. And so it was Canadian Mist, but it was actually bottled by John Hall at 40 Creek. And of course, that if you ever find one of those old Canadian bottlings, 4-year-old Canadian bottles of Canadian Mist, let me know, because I want to taste those, see what he did with them. So it's been around, but no, it's the old Seagram's distillery. is gone. It, after they closed it about 9 months later, it burned down, and there's no recovering that. There's no retrieving that at all.
Now we have a comment from Tyrone Cote. He says, Davin, that is some shirt. Are you trying out for Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? I want you to explain the shirt and the significance behind this.
Tyrone, by the way, hi, Tyrone. Tyrone and I are buddies, actually. I used to spend a fair bit of time in Africa. And I met a guy there, and we kind of became friends. He was a tailor. He called himself Lucky. I wouldn't be surprised if that was his given name. And he was in Zambia, in a town called Dodoma, and he gave me this shirt as a kind of a parting gift, and he made this shirt himself. Now it was really wonderful because he measured me, measured my arms, measured around my chest, measured around my waist, and he said, "Now go away and come back in an hour." And when I came back in an hour, he had this shirt. This is African fabric. And I thought, since it's Juneteenth today, the 19th of June, and since people are celebrating what happened to Africans who were brought to America and how they were freed, emancipated, I just wanted to remember my buddy Lucky in Dodoma. And wear this shirt. Everything kind of converged like that. I wear this shirt, all the time. But it does look African, and it does come from Africa. I've got a number of these shirts actually. But anyways, so Tyrone, cheers to you and to my friend Lucky, who's over in Dodoma. It's dark there now, but he's over there sewing shirts and pants and clothes and whatever people want to buy from him.
And to Lucky and to Juneteenth and freedom. If you're not familiar with the story of Juneteenth, I learned about this about 30 plus years ago when I arrived down in Texas and was working for an all-news radio station. And it marks June 19th, 1865, I think that's not 225 years ago, but in 1865 on June 19th was when word that the Emancipation Proclamation had actually been signed a couple of years earlier in 1863. Texas was part of the Confederacy, and on this date in 1865 was when word of the Emancipation Proclamation finally reached Texas. Back in those days, they didn't have all news radio or cable news, and since Texas was part of the Confederacy, they weren't real eager to announce a proclamation from the United States during the middle of the Civil War. But on this date in 1865 was when word got to Texas, the last state that had to be notified that slaves had been freed and slavery was finally at an end. And it took a couple of more years before I believe the 13th or the 14th Amendment to the Constitution made it permanent, but that was the end of that chapter of American history, and it is worth celebrating today. It is worth honoring. I learned about it because we covered Juneteenth celebrations every year on June 19th in Houston, because being in Texas, and that's where it was primarily a Texas holiday at first, and then spread out throughout the African American community, and then to larger community, the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. That's the significance of Juneteenth, and it's very appropriate to wear the shirt this day.
Well, I loved Africa. I spent a lot of time there. I made many, many trips and all over the north, the south, the middle, the east, the west, wherever. And I never ceased to have a really great time. I even got some African moonshine, and I've got it upstairs in my office. And, I went to a brewery where they make mealy meal beer, and, darn near fell in the vat. It was really interesting. A lot of fun.
And Graham Fraser from England, from the UK, has a question about early times. If he's wondering if the price of early times will increase in price under Sazerac or remain a starter bourbon price. It's too soon to tell. The deal has not closed yet. And I know from talking with folks at Sazerac that they did get some barrels as part of that deal. So because early times in the U.S. is primarily an American whiskey matured in used oak, so it's not a bourbon. So for that reason, they would need to get some barrels as part of that deal.
Yeah.
But my guess is that it will stay relatively consistent in those pricings, if only because one of the things that Sazerac likes to do is keep bargain prices and really try to emphasize its value brands and make a lot of money on quantity in terms of a lot of sales. Sort of like what I think Heaven Hill is going to do with Black Velvet. We really haven't seen what Heaven Hill is going to do with that one yet. What's your take on that one?
Oh, I think they're going to do some premiumization there for sure. Black Velvet is a premium whiskey in the European market, where you can get it in the European market. They make some fabulous, like the Danfield's 21, which used to be one of those. It was now a unicorn, but one of those whiskeys that everybody loved. That's made by Black Velvet. And they had the Onyx, which is a 12-year-old, a really fabulous whiskey. And they make other older, longer aged and high end whiskey. So I think they're going to continue what they're doing there. But I think that I think they're going to be looking at some premium whiskeys as well. And they've got lots of really wonderful old barrels in those warehouses in Lethbridge. They really do. And they seem very excited about the prospects. And the people at the distillery, they're very excited also about the prospects of what is going to happen now with Heaven Hill. So I don't know. I see this as a good move, quite honestly. And I think that we're going to see the same kind of thing coming out of Canadian Mist, because they have some wonderful old barrels in there, and you have to wonder what maybe those are somebody else's premium whiskeys that they're making. We don't know.
Could be. Let's bring in Brad Japhe now. Brad, how are you?
Good. Hey, everybody. How you doing? Sorry, I had some technical difficulties there a little earlier, but
don't worry about it. How you been?
I'm well.
What's in your glass?
Hold up here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, just drinking a little bit of the Dalmore King Alexander.
Nice.
I hope you guys will allow me some Scotch enjoyment today.
I'm drinking beer.
Go ahead, Davin.
I said I'm drinking beer, Brad. So.
And as I said before you jumped on, I've got the Jimmy Red Bourbon from High Wire Distilling in Charleston, South Carolina. It's made with Jimmy Red corn.
Nice. I haven't tried that stuff. How's that?
And it's wonderful. And it's one of the few whiskeys that comes in a Le Creuset decanter.
Oh boy, that's fabulous.
And the reason for that is that Le Creuset's American headquarters is just outside of Charleston. So Scott Blackwell and Ann Marshall, the husband and wife team that run High Wire, knew the folks at Le Creuset, and it sort of went from there. So they get a special batch of decanters every year to do the Jimmy Red in. So, Brad, tell us what you're doing out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You look a little bit like a sailor there with the beard since the last time I saw you.
Yeah. Just trying to work on my quarantine look. But I was out here on assignment near the beginning of March, and ended up things started to really go downhill quite fast, as I'm sure we all remember, and just kind of decided that it would probably be a good idea to try and some sort of residency here for.
And as Travis had, go ahead.
Term at least.
We are still having some audio issues.
Back to Los Angeles for water.
Brad, we are still having some technical issues with your audio. Do you want to try reconnecting in?
Yeah. How about now? Is it a little bit better now?
Much better now. Now we can hear you.
No?
Yeah, Travis Adams,
Okay.
Referring to our question about early times, there is a bottled and bond early times, and there is a bourbon out there under the early times name, best value bourbon on the shelf, and also actual bourbon as opposed to American whiskey. Marcel Dion, Danfield 21. I think he likes that one.
Yeah, I don't think anybody doesn't like it. It's a wonderful, wonderful whiskey.
And as Graham Fraser points out, not much early times reaches the UK, sadly. That might change. I know Sazerac and the Buffalo Trace folks are into exporting a little bit. Whiskey Canuck, pondering pouring myself a dram of 26-year-old Speyside bottled by the Whiskey Agency. Why are you pondering it? Go right ahead. Andy Littman says hello to Davin. And the Kilkenny Guild say hello from Kilkenny, Ireland. Great show, guys. And I think Marcel agrees with you on the Danfield comment there, Davin. So, Brad, tell us what you've been working on lately. I know you had the piece on Japanese whiskey a few weeks ago. What else have you been working on?
There's a lot of stuff going on when it comes to the evolving landscape that we're dealing with, and the direct-to-consumer market, and how we're kind of pivoting out, at least for the time being, away from some of our archaic forms of getting liquor into the hands of the consumers. So hopefully these changes will be and that sort of thing.
Do you think that we're going to see more legalization of direct-to-consumer once the lockdown ends? I know some states have at least allowed distilleries to ship directly, even in their control states, to consumers within the state. But could we see this open up more and become a full-time phenomenon?
I mean, my thought is that, it's like, letting the genie out of the proverbial bottle, that it's hard to put back in. So once people realize that, hey, why are we dealing with these cumbersome relics of a bygone era, really from the post-prohibition era, why would we electively go back to that? We've seen how easy everybody has the internet access to people making solid recommendations of the easy.
Brad, we are still having trouble hearing you at times. I'm assuming your Wi-Fi connection is
break up there at all.
Out there. Brad?
It's been pretty good. Yeah. I'm breaking up still.
Yes, you're breaking up, unfortunately, on the audio part. Do you want to try to reconnect in and see if we can get a clearer signal?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll put you out of
sure.
the screen for the time being here, and we'll wait till he comes back in. Tor Christensen says he likes Brad's shorter road to market thoughts, and Tor's based in Norway, and hopefully we'll get some of that at some point here. Chris Ratcliffe, nice to see a bit of the charming yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. No, Chris, that line is not stamped on our license plates here. This is New Jersey. They stamped something else completely inappropriate on the license plate here that I can't talk about. B. Berglund, greetings from Chicago, having a dram of Tomaten Dualkus Legacy and can't figure out why everybody knocks it. I've never knocked anything from Tomaten. About you, Davin?
I've never knocked anything from Tomaten, but I got to tell you a whiskey that I've just tasted, and it is sensationally good. And that's that 26-year-old that the Whiskey Canuck is drinking tonight. I tasted that, I think, on Tuesday. And wow. It's
That's
amazing.
One of Igor's, right?
Yeah, Igor bottled that, for the guys in Montreal. And it's, I've got to say, I don't know, that guy he's got a gift for selecting just the right whiskey. Anyways, I don't work for him, so I'm going to just stop singing his praises. But anyway, he makes some pretty awesome cask selections.
Dave Kuhn wants to know, what's your least favorite spirit? Well, that's easy. Vodka. Enough said. Davin, do you have a least favorite?
I don't know what it's called, but it's made from distilled horse milk. And it does not taste like fermented horse milk. It doesn't taste like fermented cow's milk. It was rather butyric, shall we say. But I can tell you the worst whiskey I've ever tasted. Absolutely the worst. And I'm one of these guys who doesn't do negative reviews, because I know there are 200 people in the world who love negative reviews, and then there are 7 billion other people who don't even read on if they see it's a negative review. But the whiskey that really did me in was a whiskey. It's called Ankara, distilled in Turkey. I bought 2 bottles. Well, I mean, they were $5 each. So I bought 2 bottles. I gave one to my dad, and I love my dad, and I greatly regretted that. And I drank the other one and really regretted that as well. But by and large, it's difficult to find whiskeys that aren't that good. I mean, unless you go to an independent bottler, because the quality control in these distilleries is just, amazing. It takes so many at every step of the way that it's tasted, and if it doesn't pass, it doesn't get released. So, I know there've been some of the small independents have had casks they had to sell, but other than that,
yeah, I think we really are at a sort of a golden age, if you want to call it that. And I know that term gets overused a lot, but there really isn't that much bad whiskey being produced anymore because the science has gotten so consistent that you don't find very many bad barrels reaching the marketplace.
Yeah, no, I just have to agree with you on that. Totally. Yeah.
So let's talk about the rest of the Canadian whiskey world right now, because I think we're starting to see, and you've talked about this before, this renaissance of Canadian whiskey that John Hall kicked off a few years ago. 40 Creek celebrating its 20th anniversary of its first release this year.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, 20 years. Yeah, I think that there's the new age of Canadian whiskey really was kicked off by John Hall. Now there were a few other distilleries that came on, like Glenora and Thickness, but John really had a vision of doing something really different. And he said, I'm going to have whiskey at every price point, but my whiskey is going to be just a little bit better than the competition. And he worked hard, and he had 10 years of real difficult struggle. And he walked from bar to bar in New Orleans and places in Texas. He didn't go to the sexy places, where people go to sell whiskey today. He went to where people would buy it and like it, and he really kicked it off. And I think that John Hall really kicked off what's happening now in Canada with the with the micro distillers. We have something like 70 distilleries in Canada now making whiskey, and some of it like Shelter Point or like Eau Claire. 2 brewers up in the Yukon. We have, North 7. We have Stock and Barrel. Last Mountain. We have loads of them really making fabulous whiskey. But at the same time, the big brands have also kind of jumped on the bandwagon. So we have some really high-end whiskeys coming out of Crown Royal. I mean, Crown Royal is like just so far ahead in innovation. I mean, they have been for 50 years. Innovation has been the big thing there. It's just that they don't release it until it's absolutely right. We have all these new whiskeys coming out of Hiram Walker that are just fabulous, wonderful whiskeys. Really just kind of knocking our socks off. And so people are starting to recognize this, and Canadian whiskey is kind of becoming cool again. And people like this, and a lot of people in the States. We sell a lot of whiskey in the States. It's just, I think people just had to know about it and just had to taste it. I did a tasting with Andrew Ferguson at Kensington Wine Market. I think it was Tuesday night or Wednesday night this week, and it was mostly Scotch drinkers, single malt Scotch drinkers who were there. And I've got comments afterwards. People have written to me and say, I never realized how fabulous the whiskey is that we make right here in Canada. And, we have some really good stuff, and people are starting to identify that. And it doesn't hurt, Mark, that you also talk about it, not in unwarranted glowing terms, but as part of the whole whiskey family, and so getting people out there. That's all we needed was for people to taste it, people who were influencers to taste it and make up their own minds and think how great it was. So we've got a lot of good stuff happening up here, and it's really. Hey, can I plug my book?
Let's check with Brad first and make sure. Let's check Brad's audio first.
Can you hear me now?
Sure. Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay.
You sound much better.
Thank you so much. Let's see Davin's book.
Let's see the book, Davin.
This over 200 distilleries in Canada now, and Blair Phillips and I did this definitive guide to Canadian distilleries. Definitive guide to Canadian distilleries. It's got maps how to visit the distilleries, color pictures, all that stuff. But what I'm trying to just do with this book is show that, you know, there's a real revolution in distilling up here. We've got wonderful whiskeys from coast to coast. We've got gins that you haven't tasted anywhere else. Quebec, amazing Quebec gins up there. We also have vodka that doesn't suck. We have vodka made from milk permeate, and it is creamy and lush. And we're, you know, by our Canadian regulations, they're allowed to have nuances of the feedstock in the vodka. So we've got this milk vodka from Dairy Distillery, which really it's so creamy. You want it like on ice cream. You want to drink it warm. You don't want to drink it cold. We've got vodka that's made out of blueberries. We've got vodka. Listen, we've got vodka that's made out of maple syrup. It's not sweet. It has the woody notes. So you know the soda, the woody notes that you get from maple syrup. We've got vodka that's made from apples, vodka that's made from grapes. It's just, you know, I know there's this big vodka sucks campaign on right now, and a lot of the high volume vodkas, honestly, they really are alcohol donors for mixed drinks or for screwdrivers or whatever. But some of these ones that we have up here now are just really, you know, for a palate that can taste subtleties. These are wonderful, and I understand that in the States you guys have changed your regulations as well. So you want to bet you're going to start seeing some good stuff coming out of some of the American craft distilleries as well. It's yeah. So yeah.
You're gonna have a hard
Brad,
time.
while you were gone, we had a question come in about the worst spirit you've ever tried. Doesn't have to be a whiskey, but what's yours?
Oh, man, that is. I mean, it's probably going to be in the Baijiu category, because to me, that's spirit, and not to pick on an entire category, but to me, in my personal flavor, my palate, it's kind of has always evoked kind of like gym socks and kind of some of these. Not so pleasant, funkier descriptors. You know, everybody loves funk. I love some funk in my rum, of course, and in other categories. But that type of funk is more like just stale sink water kind of notes. So I'm not going to call out any particular brands, but that is a category that's never really resonated with me personally.
So if you can tell us, what story were you working on out in the Pacific when you got stuck because of the pandemic?
Well, I do travel writing as well. So I was actually, ironically enough, writing about how the Big Island of Hawaii has dealt with a lull in tourism ever since they had a massive eruption of Kilauea in 2018. And the way that it was portrayed in the national media was that, hey, this entire island is just, you know, just a lava field. And it really wasn't the case. So they've tried to do a concerted effort of promoting tourism to this island specifically over the past couple of years. That's what brought me here, was to write about how this is, you know, a thriving island for tourism, and then of course the global tourism, you know, industry just completely shut down. So that's what got me stuck here. I started as a tourist, and now I guess I'm a local. No, not really.
Have you had a chance to go see the folks at Ko'olau Distillery yet?
Ko'olau, no. I don't know of them. I know of.
I'm not sure if they're on the Big Island or on Oahu. I think they may be in Oahu.
Okay, yeah. Are you talking about the agricole producer?
No, Ko'olau, they're making bourbon there. They've been doing hand sanitizer. It's run by some ex-military guys that we've had on the show.
No, I've never.
They're making a bourbon from Hawaiian corn.
Okay, yeah, that must be on Oahu. And have they started releasing their own stuff yet, or is it all sourced at this point?
They're releasing some sourced stuff that I think they're mixing with their own whiskey, but I know that they've got a bourbon in the works that's still another year or so away.
Yeah. What's been fascinating to me out here is that agricole style rum has really taken off, and there's a couple of prominent producers out here that are they're really exploring the varietals of cane. We tend to look at cane, just like with corn, as a monolithic crop, whereas, there's all these different varieties within it. So really we should be looking at it more as you would look like, at wine production, as grape varieties. So that's
what's the whiskey market like when you're going shopping out there? I assume you've hit a few of the stores. Can you get good whiskeys out there?
Yeah, you can. I mean, I got this Dalmore right here at the local shop. The demand isn't necessarily as high, but the distributors are all here. So, I've got a good relationship with a local bottle shop guy. So when I say to him, hey, I'd love for you to carry, you don't have Glendronach here. You've never even heard of Glendronach, which is kind of my go-to single malt. And he was able to easily get it. So it's somewhere here between these islands in some distribution warehouse. You just have to, not be afraid to ask your local vendor, your local bottle shop owner for it. And those are the types of relationships that, whether it's really good whiskey, American whiskey, bourbon, scotch, whatever we're drinking, the more that you converse and form those relationships with your local bottle shop people, that's how you get your hands on these things. And I think people are understanding that more than they have in the past.
Right. You can't walk into a shop for the first time and expect to walk out with a bottle of Pappy.
Yeah. For sure that. Davin, I wanted to go back very quickly to the Canadian side of things, if you didn't mind. Mm-hmm. It seems like a big stumbling block in the United States for a long time has been, the 9.09%, and that being that, traditionally you would use that to put neutral grain spirit or some sort of filler to stretch out the heavier whiskey that you had in there. And are you seeing now, what I love is the idea that you have freedom with that 9.09% to put in something really good and something really flavorful, rather than to make it, a lighter whiskey. You could make it a heavier and more robust whiskey. We saw that with, what was it, Dark Batch or something out of Alberta a couple of years ago, where they put in some port and some sherry. I love sherried whiskeys. And what I was realizing was like, hey, why not, instead of just putting it into the sherry cask, what about if we just put sherry directly into the whiskey? It's cheating a little bit, but the point is to drink something that you think is really delicious. So why not just do it that way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first of all, they cannot add neutral spirits at all to Canadian whiskey. And I know in American whiskey, you can only add 2.5% flavoring. Canadian whiskey, you can add 9.09, but it has to be mature spirits that you add, or wine. Now, the reality is that by and large, people only do that for whiskey that they're sending to the United States. The reason they do this is because they get a tax break if they put American spirits in their whiskey. They get, and so they can compete at the, with the less expensive American whiskeys. And that's the main reason that, like, think of a brand like Black Velvet. The Black Velvet that is shipped to the States, they use the 9.09 because they're selling 2 million cases a year, and getting a tax break, American tax break, is really significant. The Black Velvet whiskey that they sell in Canada tastes the same, but it does not have anything except the mature whiskey added in it. It's made from a blend of a 2-year-old rye, to which corn spirit is added, and then it's matured again for 3 to 8 to 12 years after that. So it's a misunderstanding that we can use neutral spirits in Canada. I know in America you're allowed to use neutral spirits to make blended whiskey, but in Canada we can't do that. So I think that this is actually one of the misunderstandings that causes people to think that perhaps Canadian whiskey is of lesser quality than some American whiskey. But the reality is it's because of a misunderstanding. Now, some of the brands have taken this opportunity to get a tax break in the States and changed it into, and they've said, oh, you know what, if we can add American spirits and get a tax break, we could also add other spirits and change the flavor. And some of them are adding a little bit of cognac or a little bit of sherry or things like that. Now Dark Batch, that they added some old Grandad 8% Old Grandad and 1% real Oloroso sherry. And they got those fruity notes, and they got, that vanilla kick that you get from bourbon. And they brought those together. And yes, that was a case where they could do that. But of course, again, they got the tax break in the States. That was fabulous whiskey.
I loved it. I was surprised that it didn't take on or didn't catch more in the States.
I think that people really just wouldn't give it a chance because of the misunderstanding about the 9.09%. But it's unfortunate. But there's other whiskey out there that they can buy. It's
so it could be anything that is matured. It just has to spend time in barrel.
It has to be barrel matured spirits or wine. Yes. But it can't be just young stuff. But some of them also, they add like 2-year-old rye, because in Canada, it's not whiskey until it's 3 years old. So some of them will add 2-year-old rye, because the way young rye really kind of sings, but you don't want a whole lot of it. But they'll add that to just kind of beef up the those rye top notes on that. So, some of them are using it quite creatively. We have a couple of brands now that are using it to adjust the flavor. I'm just going to close the door because the dog's barking.
But to me, the main message that needs to be learned or taken away from this is that rather than it being a hindrance, it's really unencumbering. It really allows the Canadian category to be a little bit more experimental, up to almost a tenth more experimental than the stricter categories that we have in the States and in Scotland.
Yeah. Well, overall, American whiskey makers have a lot more latitude than Canadian whiskey makers do, because American whiskey makers don't have to mature their spirits if they choose not to. They can add a flavoring, and it doesn't have to be mature spirits that they add for flavor.
Yeah, I'm talking, of course, about straight whiskeys.
Well, again, that's another thing, because in Canada, we don't use the term straight whiskey. We used to, and that was any whiskey that didn't have rye in it was called straight whiskey. You can add a lot of neutral spirits and say up to 80% neutral spirits in the States and still call it whiskey. In Canada, we can't add a drop. So it's kind of comparing apples and oranges. And what's really makes it even more difficult is in the last 10 years, 20 years, but in the last 10 years, bourbon has really kind of taken off. And a lot of people who haven't been around for very long, just when they think of American whiskey, they automatically think of bourbon. And so they compare Canadian whiskey rules to American bourbon rules. But you know what they say? All bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. And all that change that and say all bourbon is American whiskey, but not all American whiskey is bourbon. And they forget that, like, a whiskey like Seagram 7, which is 80% neutral spirits, sells 3 million cases a year. That's more than the number 2 Canadian whiskey sells in the States. So, there's a lot of American whiskey that is not bourbon, that doesn't follow bourbon's rules. So when people make that comparison, I think it's because they just really haven't been around long enough to know that there is this whole gamut.
Maybe they were sipping too much on that Crown Royal bourbon mash stuff, and it got them.
Oh, that bourbon mash, yeah. They still call it bourbon mash in Canada, by the way. I have to say, I don't know. It's funny because until 1964, a lot of American bourbon bottles were filled with Canadian whiskey. We made a lot of bourbon in Canada, a lot of it. Like we used to make Old Overholt. We used to make Old Crow, as it called, and things like that. Was made in Canada and shipped to the States and sold as American whiskey. Even today, you get brands like Crystal Paper were trying to pass themselves off as American whiskey. So, it's
North America. Do you consider yourself an American, Davin, being from North America?
Oh, geez.
No, I do not consider myself an American. I am a Canadian. I'm delighted to be a Canadian. I have to say, Brad, I vacation whenever possible in the United States. My favorite spot is Provincetown, Massachusetts. I've been to Cape Cod probably 50 times. I love America and I love Americans, but I am so proud of my Canadian heritage.
I was just poking fun at the labeling wiggle room that some producers have tried to swim through, if you will. That if you're producing spirit in Canada, technically you could still kind of consider it an American whiskey because it's coming from North America. You could say the same thing, I guess, about a Chilean whiskey if such a thing existed.
Yeah. I'd
But
be going to the
let's turn to
TTB
Brad,
rules.
guys, because Brad, you recently wrote about the whole Japanese whiskey issue,
Yeah.
which has the same thing.
Yeah,
It's the
for
same
sure.
that whole same issue where they can bring it in and bottle it as Japanese whiskey, even though it's made in Canada or Scotland.
And indeed, from my research for that, it turns out that a lot of that whiskey that we're drinking as Japanese is actually sourced from Canadian grain, because you look at the increase in the uptick of the importation in Japan of Canadian grain spirit, and that wasn't commensurate with them drinking more Canadian grain spirit in the bottle. So it was going somewhere, and it's going into bottles that have kanji lettering on it and selling for, 10x what it would have been when it came in from Canada.
Brad, Canadian Club built a distillery in Wood Lake, British Columbia, and they made a lot of Canadian Club there because Canadian Club was so huge at the time. They couldn't supply demand with one single distillery. But what kept that distillery afloat was making malt whiskey for Suntory, and they had 4 copper pot stills there, and they made a lowland style malt whiskey, and they shipped every single drop of it to Japan. They had a 10-year contract. When the contract with Suntory was not renewed, the distillery became unprofitable and ultimately was closed and demolished.
What year was that?
You know what? I'd have to check my records.
Because I would bet that it was somewhat before Beam Suntory came in and purchased Alberta Distilling.
Absolutely, way before. It was like 70s or 80s.
Okay, yeah.
It's got to be 80s because I know the guy who opened the distillery, and he wouldn't have been working.
To me, there's this very interesting and underreported cyclical relationship, reciprocal relationship between Canada and Japan, because it's not just this exportation of the grain spirit into Japan, but George Rifle, right, who started Alberta Distilling, he spent a lot of time in Japan learning how to cultivate and metabolize rye using these koji enzymes. And it's really fascinating that they took that knowledge from Japan and then turned around and were able to provide them with this beautiful 100% rye grain spirit that they were returning back to Japan years later.
Yeah, Rifle is amazing. When Prohibition came along, he just said, forget this, and went to Japan.
Yeah.
I'm just going to sit back here and let you two talk. I'm just going to sit here and drink, guys, because this is great.
But I feel like Alberta, certainly in the United States, we don't talk enough about how influential that particular facility is. It's not just that they provide us with so much of our craft ryes that come down here, but also, this propagation, this enzymatic process of working with 100% rye without having to bring in the malt enzymes. It's really a very unique thing that they do there.
It's very special. And, they use open pollinated rye. They don't use the high producing hybrids. They use those shriveled up, miserable little grains of rye that are massively flavorful, but don't have a whole lot of starch in them. But by using that process, Brad, they are able to convert many of the other components beyond just the starch into sugars. And because it's a broad spectrum enzyme, this koji process, they are able to produce a lot of alcohol from rye that would frustrate any other distiller. And they're able to do it cleanly. They don't get these overboils and things like that. They don't get the fermenters that's going nuts, because this enzyme is eating, all the various components of the rye and converting it into sugar, which can then be fermented. It's fabulous. And they grow their own yeast too. They grow their own yeast so they can keep that. So they can ferment all those various sugars, because that bourbon yeast is best on corn sugar.
And just a prototypical workhorse too of a distillery, because they never invested or put interest in creating a visitor center or making it look all pretty to be consumer facing. They're interested in cranking out whiskey on good whiskey on an industrial scale. They don't worry about having a nice little center for you to have some nice little toddies or anything like that, by the
No,
fire.
but visiting distilleries is not a big deal in Canada because the distilleries are so far apart that you really can only visit. Well, until the micro distilleries come along, you really could only visit one distillery in a day. It's not going to attract any tourists. But it's they don't do that.
The Canadian Whiskey Trail would require maybe like a private jet as opposed to our bourbon trail.
I've got a lot of whiskey trails or maps in my new book, so you can do a trail in the Okanagan. There's a good trail in the Okanagan. You can do in Ontario. You can do in Nova Scotia. In Quebec as well. So there are a lot of them now. But until recently, it was. There was no point in having a visitor center if people are going to have to spend half a day driving to get to see you, and then what do you do? The other thing, of course, is it's the simple matter of if you're having visitors on site, your health and safety committee has to approve it, and you have to have the insurance to cover them. And if you go to Alberta Distillers, their pot still is covered in this much batting so that nobody gets burned, and it just honestly,
it's not much to look at. I will give them that.
You're never going to.
Great question from Dave Kuhn that ties in perfectly here. Davin, how do you feel about the distilleries of Nova Scotia? You mentioned the Nova Scotia tour. I've been to Scotland plenty, but always wanted to visit New Scotland and check out those whiskey stops.
There are some really interesting distilleries in Nova Scotia, and I would start in the town of Lunenburg at Ironworks Distillery. It's in an old, blacksmith shop, Ironworks, where they made. Used to make, the steel parts for ships, and they did the blue nose, for example, things like that. And it's a heritage building, and they make really wonderful, fruit spirits there. Now, I asked them if they were ever going to make whiskey, and they said no. We don't want to go through the nuisance of grinding grain, fermenting it, distilling it. We've got all this bounty of fruits right here in Nova Scotia. I'm really a bit of a fan. There's a distillery. I'm having mind's going. Halifax Distillery in Halifax, which really very interesting rums and things like that. Glenora is a beautiful place to visit. They have chalets. Their whiskey, because they don't have a heated warehouse and it's a dunnage warehouse, their whiskey tends to mature very slowly. I think it's got to be about 15 years old before it really starts to come into its own. I found some of the 10-year-old and some of those whiskeys, I found them a little bit soapy.
Yeah. It's funny because it's almost like the complete antithesis of what we were talking about with Alberta, where and not to pick on Glenora, but I've never been truly wowed by any of their products. They did actually have an ice wine finish that I thought was pretty good, but the facility itself, I would say to anybody that's the closest you're going to come to visiting a Scotch distillery in North America.
Yeah, well, it was Bowmore helped them set that up, and they bought those stills from Bowmore, but they bought 2 spirit stills. So they don't have a wash still. So they have to do 2 runs of wash before they can do 1 run of spirit. It's it's an interesting place, but I wouldn't rank it among the top Canadian distilleries.
It's really cool though that you could stay in those chalets. It's like staying in a little cabin in the woods, and then they have this nice little pub where they're playing traditional Scottish music at night. It really does make you feel like you're in Scotland.
Janet and I stayed there for a couple of nights when I was working on the book, and it's a pretty special place. There's no question about that. Cape Breton is a very special place.
That's really interesting, though, that Bowmore helped them put this together, considering the fracture that had happened in the relation. The Scotch Whisky Association is, not too keen on Glenora using the word Glen. They tried to shut them down, right? Or make them change their name. Yeah. So there's this fracture that exists between them and the old world.
Yeah, I think that was different leadership at the SWA. I think they've moved on from that.
Okay.
I think those people are gone. And it was just absolutely nuts. But I'm sorry, Vicky has sent a note and I'm going to have to shut up.
We're blocking Vicky. I don't know why she's I didn't mean to show that.
For the record, though, now we can use the word Glen. The Scots don't own it. So if you're out there and you want to start a distillery in New Zealand or in Brazil, you go have at it and call it Glen Paolo or something. I don't know.
It's pretty devastating for a small distillery that's really not got a whole lot of financing.
Yeah.
To have to fight a well-financed organization like the Scotch Whisky Association, and then having to go from not just to court, but to the next court and Court of Appeals and to the Supreme Court to win their case. That could have put them out of business, and that might have been the game plan. I don't know.
Totally. Certainly that happens in the States, I would say, with the bigger companies. They don't even intend to maybe make it a legal matter. All they have to do is flex their muscle with a C&D, and that's enough to affect the change that they're looking for, right?
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunate.
And Tyrone also says, as a blue noser, I can confirm Davin's comments re Ironworks and Glenora, and would add Caldera Distilling too to that.
Oh, Caldera, yes. Really wonderful whiskey coming
These
out
are
of
all in
Caldera.
Nova
So
Scotia.
River John. Yeah. Another shipbuilding town. It's Caldera makes some great whiskey.
We have a question from Dave Kuhn now for you, Brad. Your article recently about the Weller single barrel release notes the secondary market will double the price. A local retail shop wants $300 for a Weller 12 here in Atlanta. Does that piss you off?
Yeah, I mean, it does, but it's completely expected. All I have to say about this is that I commend Sazerac and I commend Buffalo Trace for having the restraint, I guess you can say, to never on their end jack up the prices. They know what's going to happen the second that they release the latest Weller, and obviously any Pappy or any Buffalo Trace antique collection. And they don't, if you look at the suggested retail price of these products, they're all ridiculously reasonable. They just released the new E.H. Taylor was like an 18-year-old. And I think that it's now available. It went on the market this month, and I think it was listed at like $79.99. You're not going to be able to find that whiskey for less than $1,000. So if you're finding a Weller 12 for $300, yeah, that's really, really frustrating. But these are just the laws of supply and demand. If they stop, they just have to stop making such good whiskey, and then it won't be a problem.
There is a liquor store just a couple of miles from here that I occasionally frequent just to get beer and wine. And they have a bottle in their display case of the old Rip Van Winkle 10-year-old, the basic one, that sells for supposed to sell, the MSRP on it is something like $69.99.
Yeah.
These SOBs have it priced at $799. And I just look at them and go, how do you guys sleep at night? Because they've had that bottle sitting there for 2 freaking years.
Exactly. So for a lot of these places, it's like the quote unquote tentpole type item where they're not even planning to have it sold. They just want people to marvel at it while they go in and then buy the things that they're actually there to buy. But the best antidote that I've heard of for this type of practice, if you care about it, if you care about people actually drinking this stuff rather than them just trying to do some sort of investment play, is when they release these allocated products, that they make you open the bottle there in front of them. You don't drink it, but you open it and then you leave the store. So then you're making it clear that you're not going to immediately go off and try and sell it for 10x. I think that's a good model.
I like that. It may not be legal in every state, but I love the idea.
Yeah, the cop pulls you over when you have open liquor in the car. And
yeah. So, Davin, is there a secondary market for Canadian whiskey yet? And should there be one? For
some, there is. There's a big secondary market for Crown Royal, for some of those Crown Royals. And the prices it's really the only Canadian whiskey that really gets big prices on the secondary market.
That's the LaSalle and the Waterloos, right?
Yeah. The old ones, yeah. But because some whiskeys are released to a specific liquor chain, and of course the liquor stores are owned by the government.
In every province?
In every province except for British Columbia and Alberta. And British Columbia has both provincial stores and private stores, and Alberta has only private stores. But because you'll sometimes a one province will have a special whiskey just for them. You get people muling whiskey from one province to the next, and things like that. The secondary market hasn't really taken off, and I really hope it doesn't, because it really kind of messes everything up, and people they think it nuts. Like I remember when Crown Royal Northern Harvest Rye.
Yeah,
a $35 whiskey, and it's a great $35 whiskey. Yeah. When that was called, the best whiskey in the world, suddenly people were selling this for like $200 a bottle and $300 a bottle.
And it's dropped back down since then, yeah.
Yeah, of course it did. I mean, Crown Royal is what the real thing about Crown Royal is that there is never, ever any batch variation. The next batch was the same. The next batch was the same. They sold out. People stampeded to buy it, spent a lot of money. And those same people would have gone into the store in January or February and seen it back for $35, as much as they could possibly buy. So it was,
how the blenders do that, though, Davin, because that's a unique thing that Sam Bronfman was responsible for, right?
Sam Bronfman created a method of blending that allows them to make it the same every single time by using many components, so they don't get batch variation. And they change the recipe every year because, of course, whiskey tastes different every year because it's made from grain. Grain grows outside, so depending on the weather, the season, you get different flavors in the rye and the corn and in the barley. He developed that. I mean, that's there are a lot of Scotch whiskeys that follow the Sam Bronfman method. A lot of American whiskeys that follow the Sam Bronfman method, or some American whiskey that follow the Sam Bronfman method. And he really absolutely changed the way brown spirits are blended. Now, the other Canadian distilleries don't follow his method, and you do see batch variation, but.
Explain the triangle test they use.
Oh yeah, well, what they do is that happens at various stages. First of all, they're not allowed to use scientific instruments. It has to be done by nose, okay? Because we know that sometimes the most characterful chemicals are also there in exceedingly tiny amounts, so you can't detect them on a scientific instrument. So I mean, if it's parts per trillion, which we as humans can detect, but no scientific instrument can detect, or parts per billion. Okay, so he makes them do it by nose. He made them do it by nose. They can use the scientific instruments in the lab, in the distillery to find flaws. But when they come to blending, with a triangle test, they put down 3 glasses of whiskey. 2 of them are the standard, and 1 of them is the new whiskey. Or 2 of them are the new whiskey, and 1 of them is a standard. And what they have to do, you have to nose these whiskeys. And it's when the majority of the panel cannot tell the difference between the new one and the old one, they can't tell you which one is the odd man out. Then the blending is complete. Then they have created a whiskey that is exactly the same as the standard. And this goes on and on and on. And it's really quite it's the best quality control you can get. And by using many, many different components, they can just adjust. Okay, we need a little bit more older corn whiskey this year because we're not getting enough wood, or we need a little bit less rye because it's extra spicy this year, or things like that. So, it really is a way of making whiskey that just doesn't change unless they deliberately decide to change it. And
when you're talking about the secondary market on Canadian, I remember a couple of months ago I was in a bottle shop in New Orleans that everything was just ridiculously overpriced because it's the French Quarter. But I happened to come across a bottle of that Crown Royal bourbon mash that still had the original label on it. And I immediately messaged our friend Fred Minnick, and I showed him a picture, and I'm like, should I buy this? Like, is this a worthy investment? Because it's kind of like, when you used to collect baseball cards and you'd get a card that had like a flaw on it or something, and they take it out of production. So, it's a collector's item because of that.
Well, they added stickers to it that say, "This is not bourbon whiskey" on the box.
Yeah.
You can still buy it in any liquor store in Canada.
Yeah.
With that still says bourbon mash.
Yeah, it still says bourbon
mash. I think this is one of those things where this almost makes up for Sam Bronfman and what he did to Four Roses and screwing that up by taking it bourbon and making it export and giving Americans only the cheap American whiskey. What he did with Crown Royal sort of kind of makes up for that almost. We have a great question from Dave Kuhn for Brad now. My favorite beach whiskeys, as I call them, are Brook Laddie's Classic Laddie and Ardbeg Grooves. In Hawaii, are you drinking Glendronach on the beach and anything pairing well with Oceanside?
Well, I would think that the stereotype there would be that you'd want some lighter whiskeys when you're going to be by the beach, and maybe you would sub them in for rum in like a Mai Tai or something. And certainly I would recommend using a very light whiskey if you were going to do something like that, or maybe even like some sort of an Irish triple distilled blend would be a good thing to use there. But I like sherry whiskey under any circumstances, so I'm a little bit biased there. And yes, I do sip on my Glendronach right by the beach. Those sherry notes are sweet, and rum is sweet, and you enjoy it by the beach. So why not a sherried malt?
And this would be the perfect kind of weather for a single grain whiskey too.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If you don't like the heaviness of a malt, a single grain would go perfectly in warm weather.
Yeah, or like a lowland scotch, like a Glenkinchie, highball would be really, really refreshing on a very warm, humid day.
What about Cutty Sark?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A blend always works all year round. And Davin, we should point out, your expertise and your knowledge and your reputation is based on Canadian whiskeys, but you're also a Scotch whiskey nerd too.
Yeah, I used to think if it wasn't Scotch single malts, it wasn't worth drinking. I spent a lot of time in the single malt world as a single malt snob, and I'm so glad that I was kind of disabused of that prejudice, because I've tasted a lot of single malts and love them, but I also love many other kinds of whiskeys, including a lot of blended scotches. When people think of Scotland, they think of single malts, but 90% of the whiskey produced in Scotland is blended. And when I started drinking, it was like 96% was blended whiskey. So there's a lot of great whiskey.
I love the idea of, and I try not to write about it too much because, I just totally be, putting my finger on the scale. But I love the idea of these products that still exist out there that can have a very old age statement on them, and that they're still attainable. Single grain is certainly one of those. And the fact that you could go to a good bottle shop that would even stock in the States a single grain and get a 35 or 40-year-old single grain and pay a couple of $100 for it rather than a couple of $1,000, if not more, for that whiskey, which has incredible complexity. We're talking about, just because the fact that, there's corn involved and it's taken to a higher proof. I don't care. Like, that distillate is still going to be extremely complex if it's going to be spending 40 years in cooperage. So to spend a factor of 10 less on it than you would for a single malt, that's a no-brainer to me.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
Oh, yeah.
The other category that's still in that ilk is Armagnac, where you see, you could purchase a 50-year-old Armagnac and it would cost you like $300, $400, and that's a steal as far as I'm concerned. And
you can get even older Armagnacs, depending on where you find them, because the prices on those have not been jacked up.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of comments. Marcel Dion, without Chivas Regal, I might never have gotten into Scotch whiskey. And that brings us to a tease. This is perfect timing, guys. Thank you for the comment, Marcel, because on our next Whiskey Wednesday show, Sandy Hislop, the master blender and blending director for Chivas Brothers, will be joining us. So, Marcel, I hope you and all the other fans of Chivas Regal and the Chivas Brothers malt will join us so we can sort of tease that one. Crop Crumpler Green or 8-year-old single grain is fantastic and affordable. And if you can find it, the old 18-year-old that they bottled a few years ago before the Teeling family sold the distillery is absolutely stunning.
What a story that is, huh? The Teeling family,
yeah,
what they were able to accomplish, because they sold their their operation to Beam Suntory, right? And still, like, several years later, they built up their own brand with their own name, and then they sell that off to Bacardi, but they sold it off to Bacardi before they were even bottling their own liquid, right?
Okay, we got to correct that. They didn't sell the whole thing off to Bacardi.
Okay, all right.
Bacardi has a minority stake in the U.S. distribution rights.
Okay. I thought they sold the whole thing
No,
off, which I just thought would be so
No,
incredible because
Bacardi has a minority stake in the distillery, and that came along with their buying the U.S. rights to distribute it.
got it.
But
Because
Jack primarily, with Stephen owning a percentage of it, still owned the distillery
Mhm.
and the brand.
That's good to know. Because even when you think about the fact that we haven't even tasted, except for if you got your hands on the stuff that they just produced out of their own facility, none of us have tasted anything that's not that Beam Suntory owned liquid.
Oh no, I've tasted some of the stuff, some of their first releases out of what they've released in the last year or two.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think?
They're making good stuff. Alex Chasco, American by birth, is their distiller, and they're laying down some good stuff. It's going to get only better as it gets older, but their 3-year-old stuff is good now.
Got it.
I know I brought back a bottle of their first Irish release that they did from their distillery about, I think, a year and a half, 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. It was when I was late 2018 because it came out right about the same time Dave Pickerel passed, and I was over in Ireland that weekend, and that's when I brought it back. And we have a comment from Michael Caldwell. I think we all have that phase, but it serves a purpose. When you get versed in single malts, you can appreciate what goes into blends and other brown spirits. So single malt,
well said, Michael.
Appreciate blends. Okay, well, let's close it on this question. Usual question, Mark. What's the guest's favorite ever whiskey that they've tried? From Graham Fraser. Brad, we'll start with you. What's your favorite ever? And I know this is asking a tough question, but Graham asked it. I didn't. You have a favorite?
I mean, I actually really, really love Yamazaki 25. I think that has all of the right notes. I've tried to make it abundantly clear how much I am enamored with sherried whiskey, and to me that is like the epitome of a sherry bomb, and the craftsmanship and the meticulousness of the care that went into the original distillate is all still apparent even after spending 25 years in sherry cooperage. So to me, that's kind of like the ultimate dram, but it's also $5,000 a bottle, so I don't taste it very often.
And Sean O'Neill from Ireland points out that Teelings had a 5th anniversary virtual tasting last night. Congratulations to Jack and Stephen on 5 years, the 5th anniversary of the distillery. And Sean says it's all good. Davin, yours.
That's a difficult question to answer because, well, the thing is, there are some really fabulous whiskeys. I have a collection of Japanese whiskeys made with Mizunara, old Japanese whiskeys upstairs. I loved them when I tried them. I haven't opened these bottles, so I don't know. Maybe they will be. I love Mr. Sam, and it's so ridiculously inexpensive. It's like $300 a bottle. I love Mr. Sam. I always used to say, and I haven't tasted it for a while, but I always used to say that the Black Bowmore 1964 was my favorite whiskey. It was really, really just a stunning whiskey.
Did you get those tropical, like pineapple notes in that whiskey? Like it tasted like you're sipping on pineapples. It was so bizarre.
In the Bowmore.
Yeah, Bowmore Black.
Yeah, I don't specifically remember those. I do remember coconut. The thing that I like about Bowmore Black, I mean, the whole whiskey world went, just nuts about this Black Bowmore. It was $165 a bottle back then. And, people just were going insane about it. Now, later, there's been this thing about people don't like coloring in their whiskey. Black Bowmore was insanely loaded with spirit caramel. That's how they made it black, and it just tasted fabulous. It's honestly for more than a decade, it was my number one whiskey.
Davin, what was that release that I don't know if it was Diageo, somebody in the Scotch world back in the days of Paxaret, where they had loaded it with so much of it that the distillate the whiskey was almost literally black in the bottle. And
are you thinking Loch Dew?
That's a whiskey that people love to hate because they haven't tasted it. It's just like it's like durian. People say durian's the most horrible fruit, stinks. It's got such a bad reputation.
I'm one of them.
Well, I've sat by the side of the road in Indonesia eating durian, and I'm telling you, it was fabulous. It looks like a mouse embryo, but it tastes just insane. Well, you'll have to like garlic if you want to like durian. And Loch Dew, honestly, we once filled a bottle, not we, a friend of mine once filled a Black Bowmer bottle with Loch Dew, and people who were very well versed were pouring this Loch Dew, tasting it, and enjoying it and admiring it. So I think that Loch Dew's reputation is probably a lot worse than, the whiskey doesn't merit that reputation, but people like to have something to hate because it proves they know what they're talking about. I have a bottle of Loch Dew upstairs, which I haven't opened, but someday I will. Yeah, I'm pretty soon I'm going to start opening up my real treasures, and that'll be one of them. And if I hate it, I'll come back and admit it.
And Marcel Dion says he has a bottle of Loch Dew as well and describes it as liquid creosote.
I didn't get much creosote in it at all. No, I didn't really get any of those phenolics at all in it.
Well, guys, this has been fun. We have gone an hour and 15 minutes or so. Let me say a few closing words here, and we will finish this off. I want to thank our guests, Davin de Kergommeaux from CanadianWhiskey.org, and Brad Japhe, a freelance whiskey writer. You'll find him in everything from Travel and Leisure magazine to Forbes, Bloomberg, and just about anywhere you look on the internet. I also want to point you out to a great piece that came out today from Gabrielle on uprocks.com, and I'm whiffing on Gabrielle's last name, and I'm kicking myself for this one right now because I'm not going to look it up on the internet. But she is a writer that I've tried to get on the webcast for a couple of weeks now, and she posted her notes today about her experiences as a black bourbon writer and developing her and building her reputation and exploring the world of whiskey. And I really want to encourage you to see that. And I'm not gonna do her the disservice here of not looking that up. I apologize. Gabrielle Nicole on Twitter. She is Gabrielle Farms is her last name. She tweets under Gabby Nikki Nikki on Twitter, and she has written a couple of fantastic articles. I had invited her to be on the show today, but she writes about whiskey and spirits all the time, but she had schedule conflicts and couldn't make it. But I want to get her on one of these shows. I want to encourage you to go check that article out today on Juneteenth, and also just because she's a damn good writer. One of the things we're really trying to do on the Happy Hour webcast is uplift writers that you may not have heard much about, or you may have seen the byline, but because they don't have a lot of books out and they're not on the festival circuit, you may not know about them as much. And we're going to continue to do that. We are trying to present on these webcasts and on WhiskyCast as well. We've always focused on this. We are trying to focus on diversity. The whiskey world encompasses all races, creeds, colors, sexual orientations, whatever you want to call it. The whiskey world embraces it and encompasses it. And we are going to present diverse views. You've seen a lot of brands make statements about how they're committed to diversity. We are as well, but we're going to show it with actions rather than words by presenting diverse voices. And we are committed to that, and we are going to do that. We have done it. We will do it. And it's not something we're ever going to get away from. I hope you will join us this weekend for WhiskyCast. The podcast will be out Sunday as usual. And we'll be back next week with our Whiskey Wednesday webcast. Sandy Heslop, once again from Shivers Brothers, will be joining us. And our Friday night happy hour webcast as well. Thanks again. Have a great weekend. Be safe, everyone. Be smart. If you're out in public, please wear the damn mask. It's important, and it's going to save lives. It may not save your life, but it may save the life of someone around you that you care about a whole hell of a lot. Be safe out there, gang. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend and stay safe.